Welcome to the channel where I do all sorts of content on making open world games in Unity, and today we have a very interesting topic, which is how to place objects on the ground. Now this could be anything from a chest to a workbench, or really anything for that matter, and as you can see right here, not only are we going to be figuring that part out, but also how to give a blue preview item or even a red preview for invalid placement. Remember, if you guys want more open world content, hit that like and subscribe button, and let's head into Unity. So today we're going to be starting in this little project here, which is a very light open world startup project. If you guys are interested in downloading that, I'll give you a link in the description to the GitHub page, but you definitely do not need it. I'm just going to be using it here because I have a little character who can move around, and I want to show you what object placement looks like when you have a character that's running around in the scene. We're going to start off really easy, so let's just make a cube, which is going to be the object that we're trying to place on the ground. I'll go ahead and create a new folder under the prefabs named placeable objects. Drag your cube on into there, and then you can delete it from the scene. Now we need something to manage these objects, so let's create an empty game object named object placer in the hierarchy. Next, make a script named the same thing, object placer. Then we'll just add that onto the object placer object. Before we start coding, it's always a good idea to have an architecture in mind for what we're building. So let me just show you a quick flowchart here. The goal is we're going to have an entry point to trigger our object placement, like a keybind or an action that will enter us into placement mode. In placement mode, we will just show a preview, and if it's a valid position, we show a valid preview like a blue object, and if it's invalid, preview a red object. Next, we have a keybind or an action that places the object, but of course, we only allow for placement if we're currently in a valid state. So this is the broad strokes of what we're building. So if you ever get confused, make sure to come back to this as a reference to make sense of why we're adding a particular step. Okay, so let's open up the script, and we're going to start with a really simple piece of code, which is creating our entry and exit points into placement mode. Create a function named enter placement mode and exit placement mode, then a function named update input. So we'll call update input in our update function, then we check if the key code alpha 1 or 1 on the keyboard was pressed, and if so, we enter into placement mode. Then if we press 2, we exit placement mode. Obviously, if you guys want to change these keybinds or handle input in some other way, that's totally fine. Just replace these if conditions with whatever you need. Finally, just to make sure things are working, we print our entering placement mode here and exiting placement mode for each of the two functions. So let's go into Unity and test this out. I'm in play mode now, and you can see that in the bottom left corner, it is in fact correctly printing our entering and exiting placement mode when I press 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. The next part is obviously displaying that we're placing an object. So for this, we're not actually going to use the cube we made earlier, but a prefab variant of that cube. So why use a prefab variant here instead of just swapping materials or something? Well, let me show you a cool thing about them. So I'm creating this prefab variant here named cube preview. And speaking from experience, you are probably going to want different components on your actual world object that you place versus the preview object. So for example, the world object, we will obviously want some type of collider, like a box collider, so that we can't run through it, but we definitely do not want that collider on our preview because it should just pass through things like a transparent preview object normally does. So then in our prefab variant, we can just remove the box collider component and we're all good. So now you might ask, why make a prefab variant and not just a new prefab entirely? So here's the cool part. Say I modify our main prefab down the road, like I want a script to be added to each of them, or I want to modify the mesh. Then we can come into the main prefab, add that component, and the prefab variant automatically adds it for us. This definitely saves a ton of time when scaling out a game to dozens or even hundreds of different placeable objects, so I highly recommend using prefab variants here. All right, let's head back into our object placer script and get ready for a big coding session. So remember, all of my tutorials are open source and free, so if you'd rather just watch me code this up as I explain it and then download the script at the end, you can actually do that. I'll have a link for this finished project on my GitHub down in the description. So I do want to mention that since I give out everything for free, I'm only supported by those who can donate to me. So if you're able to, please go check out my Patreon and subscribe to me there with the rest of these amazing people right here. All right, let's get to coding. So I'm just going to talk through what I'm writing in more general terms, because this is a fair amount of code. So let's start by making some serialized fields that will be our placeable objects prefab and the preview prefab. We also need a reference to our player's camera and a layer mask, which will be the layers that are a valid surface to place our objects on. Then we have object distance from player, which is the distance the object will spawn in front of our player. Then we have a few raycast parameters for the start point, length of the raycast, and then finally the underscore preview object here will be the active game object showing our light blue or red preview. We need to store our raycast hit point in the current placement position, and we'll also have a boolean that keeps track if we're in the placement mode or not. So once we call our enter placement mode function, we need to spawn our preview game object. First, we determine its rotation from our player camera's direction by grabbing its Y rotation component. Then we instantiate our preview object prefab in our current placement position with the correct rotation and store it in our preview object variable. So obviously we also need to set placement mode to true here at the end. And okay, now we need to update the position of our prefab if we are currently in placement mode. So up in the update function, we check if we're in placement mode. And if we are, we run this function update current placement position. In this function, we get the camera's forward direction in the XZ plane and normalize it. Then we create a start position for our raycast, which is going to be in the straight down direction, but starting a little bit in front of the direction that we're already looking in. Then we make our raycast, and if we hit a valid layer, we store that hit point as our current placement position. Finally, we get our player camera's Y rotation again to set our object's rotation to be the same, then set the preview object's position and rotation. I also just realized that I made a slight error up here, so if you want to go up to the current placement position and just set that to equal hit info point, not plus equals. All right, so we're done there. Save that script and let's head into Unity. Now we got to fill out a bunch of these parameters on our object placer script. Most of them should be pretty obvious, so I'm just dragging those references in here. But for the placement surface layer mask, we actually need to make a few changes real quick. We don't want to be able to spawn objects on all layers, so we're going to create a special layer for now, just named terrain. And this will be the only layer that we can spawn objects on. Of course, you can add more if you want to later. Let's add a layer, click on the terrain game object, then in the top right, click add layer and type terrain. Make sure you can assign your terrain game object to that layer by selecting it. Now, if you're using my player controller, you actually have to make a couple adjustments here, so let's look at those real quick. You'll notice the player is on the terrain layer by default, so we want to change that. Create a new layer, name it player, and then we're going to assign our player root game object to it, and you can click yes, change all children. We also need to click on our player controller and adjust which layers are ground layers. So scroll all the way to the bottom in the inspector and adjust the ground layers mask to include terrain as well. Okay, now we can go back to our object placer script and assign our placement surface layer to terrain. I think an object distance of about 2 from the player is good, then 100 for the vertical offset and 1000 for distance. And here we are, we can finally preview what we have. So in play mode, if I press 1, you can see a gray cube spawn in, and it's tracking my camera direction and locking it into place to the position the raycast hits on the terrain. And so there's a couple issues. So 1, it's spawning like halfway into the ground, and 2, it doesn't really look like a preview. It would be nice if our object actually had some transparency or a blue color to indicate that it isn't placed yet and is a preview of the position it will get placed at. So let's get to work on the preview part first. I'm going to double click into our preview cube, and then let's create a new material. First, let me just organize the environment stuff here, and I'll call this material Object Preview Matte. Let's assign this new material to our preview cube, and it should just turn white for now. Then click back onto the preview material. So by default, Unity uses the lit shader, but we need to make some adjustments. We want to be able to see through the preview, so change opaque to transparent. Then we want to turn off receive shadows since it's not a real object in the scene. For the colors, I'm going to turn the alpha down to somewhere in the 100-ish range, then select a light blue color. Additionally, we can uncheck this specular lighting box. Okay, so I'm moving around and we see our blue preview material, but you will notice how this cube is still receiving light actually. So that's because our metallic smoothness is set to 0.5. So if we just slide that down to 0, we'll actually get a nice even color the whole way through. I also think I like closer to 75 on the alpha channel, so I'll just make that change real quick. And okay, here is our new preview cube. Let's address the second issue we talked about before, which is that the cube is getting placed in the ground. So there's a few different approaches here, but in my opinion, the best approach is to make the center of all placeable objects in your game at the middle bottom of the mesh. So you can see that in this cube, the center of the transform is actually in the exact middle. So we don't want that. We want it to be at the bottom. And obviously, if you're planning for this in advance, it's really easy to do. So if you guys have imported assets that you want to quickly adjust, I actually highly recommend this free asset on the asset store, which can quickly just adjust pivot points of any mesh. Unfortunately, I tried this for the cube, and I was unable to save the cube as a prefab because it's a built-in object in Unity. So it's not an option in this case. If it's not an option, there's an additional trick that I'll show you though, which feels a little awkward, but it totally works just fine. So we can drag the cube prefab onto the scene, create a new game object named parent cube, then drag our cube into it. So if I zero out the cube now inside the parent, then I can just move the cube's position up by half its height, which is 0.5. And now you can see that if we click on the parent cube, the position is correctly at the bottom of the prefab. Of course, now that we've done this, we need to unfortunately replace all of our cube prefabs. So just go ahead and delete those, drag in our new cube parent, and then I'll create a prefab variant again. And then don't forget in the preview cube, turn off that box collider again. And because we made new prefabs, we're also gonna have to go back to our object placer script and drag these in. All right, so we're finally back in play mode, and you can see that the cube is sticking to the right position this time. And wow, yeah, that was pretty annoying, but designing your prefabs like this will help you quickly scale your projects without creating custom coordinates for every single new placeable object. So while we're here, let's talk about some new problems to solve. If we put the preview cube into the rock or the tree objects, it's staying blue currently, which means it's still in a valid position. But we need to program in invalid positions and giving a visual indicator for that. So the other thing that we got to program in is to actually place the object. So we need like an action, like a click, to place that object into the world. So let's go back into Visual Studio and get started on those things. Okay, I'm just gonna have it so that when we click our left mouse button, we actually place the object in the world. So I'll add that to our update input function and call a new function named placeObject. For this function, we just get our rotation as we've done before, then instantiate our placeable object prefab at the raycast position. Additionally, we call exit placement mode at the end to reset our state. We need to modify the exit placement mode as well. So in here, we're gonna destroy our current preview prefab and set it to null. All right, and here we are in play mode, walking around with our preview, and I'm gonna click and boom, our cube prefab shows up in the world. Now I did just notice that if we keep pressing 1 to enter placement mode over and over, we're actually just spawning these blue prefab cubes everywhere. Then another separate issue is when I place the object, my character also punches at the same time. So even though this is a specific thing to this character controller, you're gonna eventually run into this problem in game dev. So I'm gonna show you how I solve multiple keybinds with the same key. And it actually looks like we have one more bug here, which is that we can place objects even when we're not in placement mode. So, okay, we got a bunch of things to fix. Let's head back into Visual Studio to fix all of those issues. For that first bug, it's really easy. In the placeObject method, we're just gonna return if we aren't in placement mode, and that bug is taken care of now. Okay, and this part is a little optional, but I wanted to show it. So if we have another action, like punching from our player controller, we're gonna wanna disable that action while we're in placement mode, and then re-enable it again when we exit placement mode. So if you're using my player controller, you can disable the action map that controls the punch animation. Also, if y'all want more details on how to get this player controller for free, I just made a link in the top right, and I'll also add that in the description as well. Okay, and for that last bug of placing multiple preview objects, all we gotta do is go into enter placement mode. Then if we're already in placement mode, we just return and don't instantiate our preview cube. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and delete this print statement since we know it's working. And then now we're back in play mode. And as you can see, when I place an object, we no longer are punching. And additionally, I'm now trying to click here over and over when we're out of placement mode and I'm not placing that extra cube. So the last thing to finalize this out is to turn our preview red to indicate that we're in an invalid position. This should happen when our cube overlaps something in the environment like a rock or a tree or maybe another cube. And obviously that isn't happening right now. So for starters, what we're gonna do is get a reference to our material and change its base map or albedo color. Then it turns out that we actually need to reactivate our collider in order to detect if we're colliding with invalid layers. So let's recheck this box on our collider and then check trigger to prevent us from colliding with things with the preview. We also need a custom script for our preview object. So make a script named preview object valid checker. This script will be fairly simple. We just need a layer mask with all invalid layers, a boolean named isValid to keep track of if we're in a valid collision state, and then a hash set of colliders that keeps track of which objects we're colliding with. Then in onTrigger event, we use this if statement to check if the colliding object is in any of the invalid layers. This is actually a fairly complex piece of code. If you want to look this up to understand it a bit more, it's called a bitwise left shift operator and a bitwise and operator to achieve this succinctly. So then if we're colliding with an invalid layer, we add the collider to our set of colliding objects and obviously set isValid to false. The last thing here is to also use onTrigger exit. So we make the exact same if statement check. And then this time we remove the object from our list and we only set isValid state to true if the total amount of invalid colliders is 0. Oh, and I just realized that we actually want to set isValid to true for starters. So do make sure that you change that up at the top. Otherwise you'll start in an invalid state even if you aren't colliding with anything. Okay, so then back in the editor, just assign your invalid layers to default for now. Obviously you can customize this for your project if you want as well. All right, we're nearing the end. Let's do one last chunk of coding. In our object placer script, I'm gonna make a few headers and organize our fields at the top. Then I'm also gonna add this preview material, a valid color, and an invalid color. We need to think of a way to track if we're currently in a valid build state, so I just am gonna make a boolean for that. Let's make a new method named canPlaceObject, which returns a boolean. So if our preview object is null, then we'll just straight return false. If we have a valid preview object though, then we're gonna get our preview object valid checker component and return the isValid property. We also need two new methods for setting our valid preview state and invalid preview state. In the valid preview state, we set our material color to our valid color and set the valid preview state to true. And I'm actually gonna change this valid build state to valid preview state at the top because I think that's a little bit more clear. Then we just fill out the corresponding values in our set invalid preview state. All right, then back at the top in our update function, if we're in placement mode, we check if we can place the object. And if we can, then we're gonna set valid placement state. Otherwise, we're gonna set invalid placement state. There's one last little check we needed to add at the bottom to place object. So if we aren't in a valid preview state, then, obviously we're unable to place the object, so we're just gonna return. All right, and in the Unity editor, we're just gonna quickly add in our new fields. So drag in our preview material, set a valid color. I'm just gonna choose this kind of light blue with an alpha of 75, and then as well, a light red here with alpha of 75 as well. So just remember that we did set our preview objects invalid layers earlier. So make sure that you've done that, set that to default for now if you haven't already, then let's head into play mode. All right, so I've entered placement mode. We have our blue preview, and now if we overlap our rock or tree, we indeed see the material switch to red, indicating an invalid location. Additionally, if I try to click while we're in the invalid state, it doesn't place the object, but I can place the object if it's blue. There's one final small issue here, which is currently our box is not in an invalid state when it overlaps another box. I kind of did this on purpose because I just wanted to emphasize something that's really easy to miss. So the onTrigger enter function only gets called if a collider with a rigid body enters a trigger. And earlier we forgot to add a rigid body to our cube. So go into your cube prefab, add a rigid body and set the isKinematic to true and continuous detection. Now in play mode, you can see we get the invalid indicator when we overlap a placed cube. All right, so we've reached the end, but I did want to show you how to do this with a real item like a chest or something. So I've uploaded a free chest model for you guys on my Patreon. Just come on over to my page and find the free chest model zip file, download that, extract it, and then you can drag it on into your Unity project. And you can see this is a nice low poly chest in our scene now. Notice that the pivot point is located at the bottom of the object as we want. Then let's just make a prefab of this chest. So we're just gonna copy over the components on our cube. So our chest is the same. We need a box collider and a rigid body. Then for the rigid body, we just check the isKinematic box and set collision detection to continuous again. Note that there is this secondary mesh for the lid of the chest. So I'm not gonna mess with that for now, but you could add a mesh collider to it if you wanted. Now we create a prefab variant, and all we gotta do here is swap out the material for the preview material, check the is trigger box, then add the preview object valid checker. The very last thing here is to set the invalid layers to default, and then we should be good to go. To test this object out, let's drag in our chest prefabs to the object placer. And I did just notice that our chest is rotated 180 degrees away from us. So I'm actually gonna flip the scale on X and Z to be -1 to take care of that issue. Let's check out our new placeable chest in play mode and do our final demo. So in this tutorial, we created placeable objects, which shows a preview object, which is a prefab variant. The preview material is blue and transparent, indicating the chest is in a valid position. However, if we overlap a world object on the default layer, then we move into an invalid state shown by the red preview material. Thanks for watching, everyone, and as far as I know, there aren't any bugs with this object placer, but if you find any, please let me know in the comments. I look forward to reading your comments below, so let me know what you think of the video, and if you have any suggestions, drop those down there as well. I'll see you all next time. Peace.